Have any of you ever tried or thought about creating a theme song for Bible books, for books of the Bible? Maybe taking a songbook and saying, well, if I was looking at this text, this book of the Bible, I would give it this theme song. I see a couple of heads nodding. All right, I'll be honest with you. I've never done that until this week, actually. While I was thinking over our lesson from 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, and it just kind of dawned on me that this is a song of joy. That's really what this is all about. It's a song of joy by the Apostle Paul over the Thessalonians. And so as I was thinking about that, it came to me that the song that we just sang, Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee, would be the perfect theme song for the Thessalonian letter. Because Paul is filled with joy, and that song is possibly the most joy-filled song in our hymn book. And I believe 1 Thessalonians, in many ways, is the most joyful book in the New Testament in many ways, because there just is something about it. And I know Philippians is the book of joy, because it talks about joy in all 4 chapters. And Thessalonians talks a little bit about persecution and some difficulties. But through all of that, this song of joy just springs out from the text. Beginning in chapter 1. If you look at chapter 1, he starts off in verse 2. We give thanks to God always for all of you. Then in verse 3, he gives a reason for that. Your work of faith, your labor of love, and the endurance of faith. Your steadfastness of love, and of hope. Faith, hope, and love in that text. So they have all of these things going for them. And then as a result of this, the gospel had come to them in power, and they had become imitators of Paul and of Jesus. And so in their lives, they were demonstrating their connection to the Lord and to the Apostle Paul. But he goes further than that in chapter 3, in chapter 1, verse 6, he says, you're imitators. Verse 7, he said, you became an example to all of those, not just in Thessalonica, but to everybody in Macedonia, which was their country that they were a part of. And he goes even beyond the borders of their country down to another country, down into Greece, or Achaia, as the text says. But he continues there in chapter 1, and in verse 9, he says verse 8, that their faith had gone to all of these places. Then in verse 9, they found out that, or they were able to determine that these were proved that people can turn from idols, vain, empty, meaningless, false gods, to a true and living God, and that they can patiently wait for the Lord to come. So these are these Thessalonian brethren are living demonstrations of what can be done with the gospel in the hearts and lives of people. So it is a song of joy there in chapter 1. Chapter 2 is the passage that we covered for some time, looking at the purposeful preaching. That Paul had been concerned that his preaching had been in vain, but it was not. It was purposeful. It produced results in the lives of the brethren there in Thessalonica. They had become faithful to God in many ways. And then as he says in verse 13, beginning in verse 13, actually in verse 14, he begins talking about the satanic forces and how they had overcome the efforts of Satan, who did his worst to hinder and disturb their faith. Despite that, notice at the end of chapter 2, verses 19 to 20, for who is our hope or joy or crown of exaltation? Is it not even you in the presence of our Lord Jesus at his coming? For you are our glory and joy. So the song just keeps building up. The song of joy keeps building up, and it reaches a crescendo here in chapter 3, and especially in verses 6 through 9. I want to read that again. And thank you, Kevin, for doing such an excellent job. I kind of sprung that out on you at the last second there. You had a long reading, but you did great. And verses 6 through 9 is kind of the crescendo of joy that Paul feels. Beginning in verse 9, let's read that again. But now that Timothy has come to us from you and has brought us good news, or the gospel is the word he uses there, good news of your faith and love, and that you always think kindly of us, longing to see us, just as we also long to see you. For this reason, brethren, in all our distress and affliction, we were comforted about you through your faith. But now we really live if you stand firm in the Lord. For what thanks can we render to God for you in return for all the joy with which we receive before our God on your account? What Paul is saying is that I can't even thank God enough that we'll even come close to approaching what you mean to us and the joy we receive because of your faith. Now you see why I call it a song of joy. And now you see why I think the song, verse number 27, Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee, is such a beautiful song and could be the theme song for 1 Thessalonians. In fact, you open up your songbooks. I want to read it. I'm not going to leave you in the singing. And you can look relieved about that, by the way. I'm not going to inflict you with that. We're going to read it. Joyful, joyful, we adore thee. Beginning of verse 1, he reads, let's read the words, and I want you to think about what we're saying here. And I'm going to slow it down instead of trying to sing it at speed. Joyful, joyful, we adore thee, God of glory, Lord of love. Hearts unfold like flowers before thee, opening to the sun above. I have a hibiscus plant in my yard. It's right by a park light every day. So I get out of my car and I open the door and I look at that. And the thing blooms, basically from spring until now. I should put a picture up there for you. Flowers opening up to the sun. It's absolutely beautiful. And that's what he's describing. Our hearts are like that. So you see why this is a song of joy. Melt the clouds of sin and sadness. Drive the dark of doubt away. Giver of immortal gladness. Fill us with the light of day. All thy works with joy surround thee. Earth and heaven reflect thy rays. Stars and angels sing around thee. Center of unbroken praise. Field and forest, vale and mountain, flowery meadow, flashing sea, all of the things around us that bring us joy and happiness. Cry, chanting bird and flowing fountain, call us to rejoice in thee. And verse 3, thou art giving and forgiving, ever blessing, ever blessed. Wellspring of the joy of living, ocean depth of happy rest. Thou, our Father, Christ, our brother, all who live in love are thine. Teach us how to love each other. Lift us to the joy divine. Mortals, join the mighty chorus, which the morning stars began. Father love is reigning over us, o'er us. Brother love binds man to man. Ever singing, march we onward, victors in the midst of strife. Joyful music leads us onward sunward in the triumph song of life. It's just a song of joy. Absolute, unmitigated, unlimited joy. It's just an exuberant joy that he finds there. And I think that's what we see in 1 Thessalonians this chapter as well, is that Paul is building in his introduction, in chapters 1 through 3 is really the introduction to the book. So, believe it or not, we're actually going to finish the introduction of the book today. And we'll continue to get into the meat of the text next Sunday. And we've talked a number of times about Paul inside. In fact, I forgot I had that on the screen for you to read the text. But Paul and Silas had come to Thessalonica, and after about 6 months, they were driven out, and they went to Berea, and there they were there for a long enough time to start a good church. They had great success. They converted some of the Jews and some of the Gentiles, and there was some peace there until unbelievers, evil men came down from Thessalonica to stir up a crowd, and they ended up having to leave town again. And they ended up going down to Athens, or Paul went down to Athens. But notice, if you will, look back quickly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time covering this because we have reviewed this before. But look back in Acts chapter 17 very quickly. That Paul had been in Thessalonica, and then he was in Berea. But because of the persecution that came down from Thessalonica, in verse 14 it says, then immediately, this is Acts 17, verse 14. Then immediately the brethren sent Paul out to go as far as the sea, and Silas and Timothy remained there. So Paul went down to the sea, and Silas and Timothy stayed in Berea. Now those who escorted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they left. And then we read in verse 16, now while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was being provoked with him as he was observing the city full of idols. Now we read that, and then we see that Silas and Timothy are not mentioned again in Acts until chapter 18 when Paul's in Corinth. And so what we might begin to think is, well, for whatever reason, they never showed up. They didn't come down to Athens, even though he had specifically told them to do so. But what we find here in 1 Thessalonians is that they had to have come to Paul in Athens, because Paul sent Timothy back to Thessalonica and Silas up to Macedonia, or to Philippi, and then they came down to him in Corinth. And we read, this is in Acts chapter 18. They come back to him in Corinth. In Acts 18, verse 5, it says, "But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ." Now, a couple of things we can learn from that passage is that apparently when they came, this brought encouragement to him in a way that freed him to serve the church and to preach and teach without having to work for a living on the side, making tents like he had been doing. That also tells us that at least the Philippian church had sent money to support Paul, had probably sent money to support Paul, because in the Philippian letter he talks about how they kept sending him money, and had done so twice while he was in Thessalonica. So they were a very supportive church of his for him, supporting him greatly. But when we turn back to 1 Thessalonians, we read why Paul and Silas and Barnabas came to Paul, or at least Timothy especially. Timothy and Silas came to Paul. Chapter 3 says, "Therefore, when we could endure it no longer, we thought it best to be left behind in Athens alone." Well, you read Acts, you think, well, wait a minute, wasn't Paul already alone in Athens? No, obviously Timothy and Silas had come down to see him there. So in verse 2, from Athens, he stayed there. We don't know how long he was in Athens, long enough to convert some people. In verse 2 it says, "And we sent Timothy, our brother and God's fellow worker in the gospel of Christ, to strengthen and encourage you as to your faith." So while Paul was in Athens, Silas and Timothy had come to him, and he sent Timothy back to Thessalonica, and apparently he had sent Silas with him to go all the way back to Philippi. And so he had sent them out for them. And so these passages all tie together to give us an idea of what was going on. I think as a side note, I think it's important to notice, the New Testament doesn't record every single event that takes place. It says nothing in Acts about Silas and Timothy coming down to Paul in Athens. But the Thessalonian letter shows that they had done so. So you have to read all these things and put them together. As one preacher said to me a long time ago, reading the New Testament is like reading somebody else's mail. And it's important to understand. It's like taking letters that have been written to various people, and you have to put together with other known facts, to take that information, put it together with other things you know, to get a chronology and a timeline and an idea of all the things that are taking place. And the other thing that we probably miss out on, or don't think about very often, is Paul's associates, like Silas and Timothy and others that he mentions in other letters. They're coming and going back and forth between various churches to wherever Paul is, informing him, keeping him up to date, taking messages back and forth with all these churches. And so Paul is actively, even though he's preaching and teaching and he stays in Corinth for a year and a half, even though he's staying in these places for some time, he's maintaining ties to these other churches. And so when he finds out about the good news that Timothy has about the brethren in Thessalonica, he just bursts out in a song of joy because he is so happy about what they're doing. And so what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look very quickly at 4 things about the brethren in Thessalonica, 4 verses, if you will, of this song of joy. And we're going to see in these why Paul is filled with joy. The first thing is we're going to see an unshaken faith. Verse 1 is the unshaken faith of the brethren in Thessalonica. Verse 2 is the unmovable stand that they had taken for the truth and for God. Verse 3 is their unlimited love, and then verse 4 would be their unblemished heart. So we're going to look at all of chapter 13. We're going to do something you probably thought I would never do, cover an entire chapter in one sermon. But we're going to do it because it's basically just a song of joy. Not a lot of detail in there, but there's a lot of information, and there's some good things we can learn from it. And at the end, we'll have some takeaways of how we can be like and emulate or imitate the Thessalonian brethren. These are the four things that make up Paul's song of joy, his exuberant song of joy because of these brethren and their love for the Lord. Let's go first to the unshaken faith, the unshaken faith. And these will all be up there if you didn't get them all. We'll get them back up there for you in a minute. The unshaken faith. And that's chapter 3, verse 1 through verse 6a. Let's read the text and just give you a few thoughts here. Verse 1. Therefore, when we could endure it no longer, we thought it best to be left behind at Athens alone. And we sent Timothy, our brother, and God's fellow worker in the gospel of Christ, to strengthen and encourage you as to your faith, so that no one would be disturbed by these afflictions. For you yourselves know that we have been destined for this. For indeed, when we were with you, we kept telling you in advance that we were going to suffer affliction, and so it came to pass, as you know. For this reason, when I could endure it no longer, he's kind of repeating himself what he said in verse 1. I could endure it no longer. I also sent to find out about your faith, for fear that the tempter might have tempted you, and our labor would be in vain. But now that Timothy has come to us from you and has brought us good news of your faith and love. Timothy has brought good news to them. Now he says in verse 3, there's an interesting word in verse 3. No one would be disturbed. Some of your versions may say shaken, and that's where I get the idea of shaken. The idea is that of a dog's tail being wagged. Anybody got a dog with a long tail? Our dog is, her tail's about that long, and it will beat you to death. It knocks our granddaughter over sometimes. It's so hard, it just beats it wags so strongly because she's excited. She gets happy, and that tail just goes wagging. And so that's a word that then is used to describe the idea of people being shaken like a dog's tail. And he says that you were not shaken like that, or you're not disturbed by that. They were concerned that the persecution, Paul was concerned that the persecution would have shaken them. It would have disturbed or upset their faith. But it had not. They were not shaken by that. In fact, it's interesting. You may, if you've looked up the word, if you ever look up the word in a dictionary, a Bible dictionary, or a thesaurus, it'll also give it the idea of being manipulated. Because does your dog ever wag her tail and stare at you with those big puppy dog eyes, trying to manipulate you into giving you a treat, or letting you go play, or whatever it is they're wanting to do? And so it had come to be used in that sense. But obviously in the text here, it's talking about the idea of just being shaken like the tail would be shaken when it's wagged, because he's talking about in verse 3 that no one would be disturbed by these afflictions. Not being manipulated, the effort is to shake them up or destroy their faith. And so what we see is Paul had reached his limit there in Athens. Silas and Timothy had come down from Berea. He's teaching, and his soul is stirred up by all the idolatry there, and he's preaching and he's teaching. He's trying to reach hearts with the gospel. And Paul and Silas come, and you know what is on Paul's mind? Not just the unbelievers and the pagans there in Athens, but the Thessalonian brethren. He's worrying about them. Remember that the brethren in Thessalonica had to post bond. Think of it, Bob and Steve, and maybe some of you others get pulled out, and you have to post a bond to make sure that McClenny guy or that Tucker guy doesn't come back to Litchfield anymore. They're troublemakers. We don't want them in town, so you got to post a bond promising that you'll keep them away. And there's pressure and stress being applied to the church there. So much that in 2 Thessalonians, the implication may be that some brethren had been killed, actually, because of their faith. But in the midst of all of that, Paul's joyful. But he's worried. He's down in Athens, and he's got nothing. You know, they don't have cell phones. They can't call. They don't have internet. He can't get an email. So he doesn't know what's going on up there. So he just can't bear it anymore. So he sends Timothy up to find out what is going on. And he's going to do two things. He wants to do two things. He wants Timothy to go up there and strengthen them. He's going to have them strengthened. And he wants them to encourage them in their faith. The word strengthen means to firmly plant their feet so that they won't be shaken. And encourage is the word for call along to our side for support. When you're down, when you're discouraged, or you're hurting, you need support. I would imagine, Brady, when you fell yesterday on your bike, you didn't get up and just ride on act like nothing had happened. You had to get some support, didn't you? You had to get some help. You had to get some help this morning, and you will for a while, depending on how serious it is. Mac is going to need some support because he's lost his sister. And apparently she's been sick for a long time, and so in many ways it's like he's losing her all over again after her being sick for so long, now that she's died. And he will need support. He'll need us to put our arm around him and encourage him and support him. And I would recommend that since they're not here today, I can say this since he's not here, give him a call. Call him on your phone, talk to him, and all you have to say is, Mac, I'm sorry about your sister. I love you. I'm concerned about you. I'm thinking about you. That's all you got to do. Doesn't have to be elaborate. Doesn't have to be fancy. All you have to do is let him know that you're caring about him. I can tell you the value of a phone call. The value of a phone call when someone loses a family member. When my brother-in-law died several years ago, one person called my wife, his sister. And it broke her heart. It broke her heart. A few people texted, and people came to the funeral, and they were supportive, but one person called. And the rule we took away from that was that somebody we know and love loses a loved one, we call them. If we're not close enough to go see them, we call them. So call them and encourage them. Because that's what Paul was sending Timothy to do to the brethren, to encourage them, because they were under stress, they were under difficulties. They were being afflicted. That word affliction is an interesting word. It's like the idea of being crushed between two hard surfaces. You know, we use the phrase stuck between a rock and a hard place. That's the affliction, that was pressure that was being put on them. And he was wanting them to be encouraged even in the midst of that. And encourage them because of their faith. He uses that 5 times in the text here in chapter 3. Your faith. Your faith. And it continues on down in verse 7. Your faith. And again, at the end, your faith. So he's always about their faith. He's talking about their faith, that he wants that to be encouraged. And now he's in Corinth. Still doesn't know what's going on. And Silas and Timothy come, and Timothy brings the news. And so he breaks out in a song of joy. They're doing great. They're holding on. They're not giving in. And so he's excited about that. He brought this good news. And it's a word for gospel, just like that we're used to. They're the good news of their faith and love. He's excited about that. So that's the unshaken faith. That's the song of joy that believers can bring to those who teach them and those who encourage them and to one another. We'll talk about that more and wrap up with our takeaways. The next thing is an unmovable stand. This is the second part of verse 6 down through verse 10. He says, and that you always think kindly of us, longing to see us just as we also long to see you. For this reason, brethren, in all our distress and affliction we were comforted about you through your faith. For now we really live if you stand firm in the Lord. So having felt this pressure of not knowing what was going on with them, now that he knows that they are standing firm, it allowed Paul to live. Now you parents, speak to the parents here. You know what it's like when your children are away? Especially your new parents. The first, and I didn't get a chance to talk to any of the young moms about this, but I wish I had now. What was it like the first time you handed your grandbaby off to your mom or your mother-in-law and said, here, can you keep him or her while we get away? It's not easy. And the whole time you're gone, maybe it's just for a couple of hours going out to eat, or maybe it's overnight, regardless of the length of time, the whole time in the back of your mind is the thought of what's going on with my baby. That's the way Paul was feeling while he was away. But now that he knows what's going on with his baby, this church in Thessalonica, he can breathe. A weight is taken off of his back. He is able to be alive and rejoicing. And that's why he continues. But he still wants to be with them even more, even though he's just got the news second hand from Timothy. He still wants to be with them. The third thing that we see here in the text is that there is an unlimited love. Now, in verses 11 through 13, Paul gets into what we would call a prayer, a kind of an intercessory prayer, but he's addressing it to the Thessalonians. Notice he says in verse 11, "Now may our God and Father himself and Jesus our Lord direct our way to you." So he wants to be with them. He's asking God to direct them to them, but he's saying this to them. So he's taking into consideration their thoughts and what's happening with them. And so what he's wanting out of them is an unlimited love. Verse 12, he says, "And may the Lord cause you to increase and abound in love for one another and for all people, just as we also do for you." So he wants them to increase. He wants them to overflow in love toward one another, toward each other. And so the congregation there is supposed to be loving one another, reaching out to one another, and supporting and encouraging one another. And he wants them to be a super abundant, excessive, overflowing love that goes beyond them to everybody. Exceed the expectation and overflows. That's the unlimited love. And then the fourth verse there is the unblemished heart, verse 13. "So that he may establish your hearts without blame." That means unstained by sin, unblemished, "in holiness before our God and Father at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ with all his saints." And so the idea is he wants them to be free of contamination, holy, set apart to God, belonging solely to God, and committed to serving and living for him. And with that, we finish the introduction of 1 Thessalonians. And we covered chapter 13 in one lesson. Next week we'll get into the text of the letter, or the meat of the text in chapter 4. But let's go end with some practical takeaways. First thing is, don't get wagged by the dog of cultural events or sin and failure. And we're in a political season. There's an election in a couple of months here in Kentucky, and then another election next year nationwide. And well, the ads are on. I do everything I can to avoid television, especially at least commercial television. But every once in a while, like yesterday, watching a couple of football games, commercials come on, and it's political ads. I'm like, I don't want to hear it. Because all it does is get people stirred up. Yes, who gets elected does have an impact on the kind of pressure we may feel culturally and financially because of various policies that are put in place. But for us here in Kentucky and in America, those are so small in comparison to the greater problem of sin. Sin and the failures that come from us failing to do the will of God perfectly, to either not do the things we should do or doing the things we shouldn't do. And so Satan always wants to shake us up with sin, with temptation. That's what he talked about the tempter. He was afraid the tempter had tempted them. He doesn't want that to happen to us. That's far more pervasive in our life than any kind of political pressure. I want to say this too. Make sure your political beliefs, and I really came to this a few years ago when I was preaching in Clearwater, because we had some really aggressive political people there. Make sure your political beliefs are driven more by the love for lost souls than the size of your retirement funds. I'm not saying that you have to keep your retirement funds small. That's not the point. The point is, what's your motivation? When you support a political party or a political candidate, is it because he's going to protect your money or because he'll have a better moral stance that might help make it easier for you to be influencing people for the Lord? So we need to fight against Satan's temptations in every form, because he will shake us up. He'll let us become the tail, and he's the dog just wagging us away if we let him. Second thing, take a firm stand for the Lord. And examine your heart. This means examine your heart and make sure nothing is holding you back from a total commitment to God and your brethren. Think of it this way. If Paul sent Timothy here to Lilac Road, Church of Christ, he would come here and to strengthen and encourage you and then report back to Paul. And he looked at you individually. I want you to make this individual. Don't look at somebody sitting beside you. Don't look at somebody sitting behind you or in front of you. Look at that person that you see in the mirror when you shave or comb your hair or put on your makeup or whatever it is you do. Hopefully you don't shave and put on makeup. But anyway, what would Paul say about you? I mean, what would Timothy say about you to Paul? Is this the person that stands firm for the faith in everything and in all things? Next thing is overflow with love for all your neighbors. Just some practical takeaway here. Make a list, or just take the directory. Go through the directory and look at everybody's in that directory. Make sure that you know who they are. And if necessary, beat me to the back door on Sunday mornings and on Sunday nights and talk to people you don't know and find out about them. Ask them questions about their lives. You'd be amazed what you can find out about people if you just ask questions. With a sincere interest in them rather than with looking for an opportunity to tell them about yourself. And I fall for this. Everybody does. I do it. Somebody say something, then I got to tell the story. But and it becomes about me. We have to stop it. We have to fight that urge. I worked with a lady one time who we were having a conversation, and I said, at the time we had a dog that was sick and had just passed away. We just put it down. And I was telling her about her. I was halfway through my second sentence. Oh, well, I had a dog, and she just interrupted me and ran over everything I was trying to say. Don't be that person. And then look around you in your family and at work or play or in others that you know, and start looking at people and making a list in your mind. Maybe even write it down on your phone, on a piece of paper or in your phone, and think, I want to pray for this person. I want to influence this person. So I need to find out more about them. Start asking questions. Start finding out about them. Reaching out to them. Getting to know them so that you can have an influence on them. And not just to influence. Don't make it a manipulation effort. Make it a genuine effort to be overflowing with love. And the last thing is pursue purity with a passion. Don't grow accustomed to sin in your life. If you have sin in your life, if there's some nagging sin that you just keep fighting, don't give up. Don't quit. Don't decide, well, I can't do it, I can't defeat it, so I'll just live with it and trust God to forgive me. No. Pursue passion or purity with a passion. Think of it like pulling weeds out of a garden. You get in there and you dig it up, you pull it up, you shake the dirt off, and make sure you got all of the little roots. And if there's got bulbs, you want to make sure you get all those bulbs, and then you pile it up and you go burn it. You make sure it is done with. Sin is not something to joke around with, or joke about, or play around with. It will destroy our souls. So pursue purity with a passion. And we'll get into that in more detail next week with a lesson on a transcendent walk in Christ from chapter 4. Well, all we'll end with now is just a prayer that God's message to you will be a song of joy. Is God's message to you a song of joy? I hope so. If you're not a Christian, it's not. It's a song of sorrow and despair. But if you're a Christian, that can be changed. Just as Paul was pressured and sorrowful, this was turned around when he got the good news. And you can turn around that song and make it a good song, a happy song, by turning to the Lord and being baptized into Christ today for the forgiveness of your sin. Or maybe you're struggling and you need encouragement. We're here. We're here to help you. We're here to help you sing a song of joy. If you will, open your Bible to the songbook, and if you can, if you want to,